Dr. Joan Borosenko is a respected scientist, licensed clinical psychologist, gifted therapist, and best-selling author. Trained in cell biology, she received her doctorate from Harvard Medical School. She is a pioneer in the field of mind-body health and well-being.
Thanks so much for that great warm welcome. I'm excited because today I get to talk about my favorite subject, what fascinates me the absolute most, which is the power of the mind and its effect on our body and, of course, on our life, on our attitude, on our outlook. And also a tad today, we'll talk about the system of medicine and how it's changing. I know from the conversation we had before we started that most of you are members of HMOs. And I got the neatest email from somebody, and it was entitled, Frequently Asked Questions About HMOs. And one said, is it true that my general practitioner can do a heart transplant right here in his office? And the answer was, well, what have you got to risk? It's only a $10 copay. We do live in a time of tremendous medical miracles, fabulous technology. And we also live in a time when there's a growing understanding of how the stress in our life affects our health and our well-being. And I think we live in a great time because people are interested not just in how can I make myself better if I'm ill or avoid illness, but how can I really feel great? How can I make the most of my life? How can I beat stress and come to that place where I feel joyful? And those are the things that we're going to cover today. Now, I have a little story to tell you because people frequently say, how'd you get so interested in this area? And why are you so passionate about it? And like many people who go into the healing arts, I had a personal story that really led me there. And it started when I was 10 years old. And 10 years old, 5th grade, you know how little girls are? They're all excited at that point. The world is their oyster. And then overnight, something happened to my brain. And I became psychotic. I could not tell night dreams from daily reality. And then on top of that, I developed an illness called obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. Maybe some of you read the book called The Boy Who Couldn't Stop Washing. And OCD is a set of rituals that people can't stop themselves from doing. They're compulsive. It was tough. Can you imagine being the parents of a little girl who suddenly has this kind of terrible illness? And at that time, there really wasn't much help in psychiatry. We hadn't developed some of the wonderful drugs that would help. There wasn't much in the way of behavior therapy. And after a couple of months in what I would consider a state of hell, one day I sat down and I prayed. And I'm wondering, I'm looking around and I'm seeing some of you have that look on your face. You know what it is like to pray when you're really at the bottom. When every fiber of your being says, I surrender. I need help from some higher source. And during that prayer, I had really an amazing experience. I felt almost like my boundaries had melted away, and I was part of something much larger than myself. And that something was absolute love and absolute wisdom. And I felt safe for the first time in many months, almost like I was truly being held in the palm of a larger hand. Suddenly, I felt exactly what I needed to do to recover from this illness. And sure enough, over the next couple of days, I did what that kind of inner wisdom had told me to do, and I recovered completely. It is a kind of interesting thing that nobody in my family mentioned it again. It was, and you can see why. There must have been this great fear of don't go back there. But years later, I can tell you that it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because that illness and what was truly a spontaneous remission, if you will, set the course of my life. Because I kept wondering as a kid, what happens in someone's brain? What was it? Was it one hot dog too many? Did I go over the nitrate deep end? What was it? The psychiatrist tried to tell my mother it was because she didn't let me cross the street. But even she knew it must have been something more than that. So I was determined to know what's the brain chemistry involved. And I said, I will grow up to be a neuroscientist. And then I thought, here's a family in crisis who needs help. And we really didn't get what we needed. So I thought, heck, that's what psychologists do. I'm going to do that too. And then there was, what was that masked rider? What was that spiritual experience that happened? Because certainly in all my religious background, I was unprepared for that sense of unity with all being. So I ended up wanting to study the spiritual traditions from around the world, which I've done. And braiding together science, psychology, and spirituality is what my passion has been for the 45 years since that experience. So imagine how thrilled I am to get to be here with you today and share this passion with you. I had a chance, fortunately, to go to Harvard Medical School to study there first in a field of really molecular biology, cellular biology, and then behavioral medicine, and get licensed as a psychologist and co-found a mind-body clinic. And that clinic was filled with people just like you and me. People who were just trying to reduce their stress and to live a better life, more creative life, more joyful life. And what I discovered then is that stress accounts for somewhere between 75 and 90% of all visits to the family practice physician. That's a lot, isn't it, when you think of that? So after all, just the normal stresses and busyness and pressures of life can give rise to headaches and backaches and stomach disorders. And as you know, that's really where the quality of life is. I also had a chance to work with people who had more serious illness. And from them, I learned an awful lot about priorities in life. God forbid, there's nothing like a serious illness to tell you, you got to live now, because you never know when the last minute is. So I get to share all of this wisdom with you today. What I hope that I will be for you is a voice of reason, that I like to balance certainly the spiritual and psychological, but to me, you got to show me the data and the studies. I love the studies, and we're going to share some of them together now. One of the most interesting things about mind-body medicine is that we've all known that the mind affects the body simply by being human, but it seems we need studies to convince us. So, for example, how many of you blush easily? Anybody blush? I know I blush easily. And there's the mind-body connection. You have a thought, and right away it changes the vasodilation of your blood vessels, and you blush. Or maybe you've gone to the dentist with a terrible toothache, and the minute you get into the waiting room, it goes away. All kinds of mind-body examples. When I was little, I saw a fabulous example of this. My kids are in the audience. Do you guys remember Uncle Duck? Sure. Yes, they remember. Uncle Duck was actually Uncle Dick. And my Uncle Dick was famous in our family because he hated cheese. Once he'd eaten it and it had made him sick. And you know how that is. Something that's made you sick once is disgusting forever after. So my mother made a piece of cheesecake She made great cheesecake all covered with berries, and he ate a piece, not knowing what it was. And he loved that cheesecake. An hour later, he said, "Lillian, it was so good, give me another piece." And he ate it. And she then said, "But Dick, it was cheesecake. I know you hate cheese." And at the sound of the word cheese, he threw it all up on the rug. When you are 6, this makes an indelible impression. And my mother kept bringing it up through the years as a mind-body example. Clearly, it was not the physiology of the cheese that was the problem. It was a thought about the cheese. The mind is so powerful. It is an amazing thing that our thoughts about life can affect our body. And if you think your thoughts about cheese are powerful, your thoughts about yourself and where you stand in the family of things are even more powerful. Some of the data in mind-body medicine, if you want to boil them all down, they come down to one thing, that our sense of connectedness, a sense of good connection, respect for yourself, a sense of good connection with others, the ability to give and to receive love, is the most powerful thing your mind can do, because that's what reduces the stress in your body and restores you to a state that physiologists call homeostasis. Remember that from high school? Homeostasis, the state of perfect balance. So to get to that state of homeostasis and peace, we need to reduce the stress. One little further personal addendum on stress-related disorders. When I was in graduate school, I had a nickname. I was called Psychosomatic Sally. And I had just about every stress-related disorder that had been reported in the literature. So I had high blood pressure, rapid and irregular heartbeat, migraine headaches, irritable bowel syndrome, which is like having a migraine headache of your lower parts, and low back pain, Meniere's disease, which makes you dizzy, and anxiety attacks. Otherwise, I was fine. None of the doctors that I went to could do anything. What I did was I collected a prescription from each specialist, and not a single one said, "Hey, who are you? And how are you really? What is it that makes your heart sing? What is it that gives you joy? How do you think you're doing in your life? What are your relationships like?" You know, they might have found out something that I was in the middle of a divorce from an early marriage, and I had a young baby, and I was trying to get through graduate school broke. This might have been part of the problem. But nobody asked. And that's often what we complain about in medicine, isn't it? We just want to be seen as human beings. What happened was that I had a graduate student friend in physiology at Harvard, and he did a wonderful thing. He said, "Joan, the only trouble with you is that you have a very powerful mind. And what's going on is that you make these mental movies about disaster. You'll fail this course, you'll starve, your kid won't grow up well without your being there, and your body responds to the movies of your mind. Because your body cannot tell the difference between what is actually happening and what you are imagining. It's all the same." So he said, you have to learn to manage your mind. You have to learn to let go of those negative movies and come into the present moment. And he suggested that I take up yoga and meditation. So I did. The amazing part is that within 6 months, all of the stress-related disorders had disappeared, which of course made me a hideous zealot. Oh well. because I know it works, because I know these little changes can not only affect your body, but just make your life so much more peaceful. Let me give you a couple of examples of studies in the field of mind-body medicine, because the last 10 or 15 years has found a burgeoning of studies looking at how the mind affects the immune system, how the mind affects the heart. I mean, you can't even buy cat food anymore without claims that it boosts the feline immune system. Isn't that true? It's amazing. I used to do research in this field, which is called psychoneuroimmunology, or the effect of the mind on the immune system. The funny thing about that word is that it is not easy to pronounce. And at conferences, at least a dozen times, I've been introduced as a pioneer in psychic numerology. Yes, and then I think all those Harvard credentials for nothing. I could do better with the 900 number. Now, what we know with psychoneuroimmunology is, for example, every thought you have affects the immune system. This may sound far-fetched, but there's a great deal of evidence to back it up. Some of you know the work of Dr. Candace Pert, who originally started the National Institutes of Mental Health and was the co-discoverer of the endorphins, the body's own endogenous or internal pain relievers. Candace began the study of the whole field called informational molecules. Great word, huh? Or neuropeptides, neuro being the brain and peptide being a small protein. So we're talking about small proteins made in your brain that bring information to the rest of the body. It turns out that emotions are the link between the body and the mind. Emotions are the link between the body and the mind. Every emotion releases a different mix of neuropeptides. So, for example, if you feel sadness neuropeptides, if you will, are released from the brain, go out through the blood system, and bind to receptors on every cell of your body. If, on the other hand, you laugh and you feel joy, a whole different set of neuropeptides is bound to your receptors just like that in a millisecond. Pretty amazing, isn't it? And I'm sure actually that laughter is the best medicine. Can't you feel the difference in your body just from a couple of laughs? But now we're beginning to understand the molecular underpinnings of how our thoughts affect our emotions and how they affect our body. We're also beginning to understand the mechanisms of stress itself. Fortunately, I can tell you, acute stress is not going to be bad for your body. For example, running off from a mugger. That's the fight or flight response, and we survive because of it. What turns out to damage the body and also damage your mood over a long period of time is chronic stress. And chronic stress, I think we're all chronically stressed because the world is so busy and so crazy. But in addition to that, things that cause us chronic stress are just the obvious thoughts we have during our life. And one of the biggest ones is low self-esteem. All the times that we're mean to ourselves, that we sit around and think, I am a worthless worm. Anybody else would have done this differently. And of course, soon you look around and you realize most of us have thoughts like this. Or when we have thoughts of, I'm helpless in this life. I can't do what I want to do. Those are the kinds of things that cause chronic stress over time. And they've studied people who, for example, were abused as children or who were survivors of war. And the chronic stress shows up in high levels of a hormone called cortisone in the blood. Cortisone in high levels can damage the heart, it depresses the immune system, and it also changes your brain, so you actually don't remember things well. This, I think, was a good deal that God made, because if your life was lousy, then you get to forget it. The last little study that I want to tell you was actually done at Yale. And what they tried to figure out was, taking a group of people just like us, what made the difference between who was healthy 10 years later and who had taken ill. And of course they thought, well, maybe it's a certain laboratory test that we can do. And believe me, they did a whole battery of tests, physical and psychological. It turned out that the people who stayed well 10 years later had one thing in common. They thought they would be well 10 years later. That was it. That's the power of belief. That's the placebo effect. And you think of that, what an amazing thing. You can give people in pain a sugar pill, and 50 to 60% of them will have less pain. In fact, almost 50% of us will respond to a placebo of any kind. It's the power somehow of our belief, which is an important thing. One of the things I think might be really injurious in our particular culture is that we've become a bunch of unrepentant health nuts. There's nothing that's good for you anymore whatsoever. Isn't that true? You go to put something in your mouth and you're thinking, my God, if I eat it, I'll die. And there may be a part of that that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The key to mind-body medicine is this. Your mind is powerful. It's possible to reduce the stress, to bring your body back to homeostasis by really learning to manage your mind. That we can all manage to do this. And when we do this, when you get the stress off your body, a wonderful thing happens. Nature can heal you in its own way. It was Florence Nightingale, who is the founder of nursing, who said one of the most important parts of medicine is to put people in the best condition for curing, and that is to put them in the condition of homeostasis. Then, if you've got a stress-related illness, that's enough, and you'll heal from it. And if you do need surgery or medication or other things, your body is in the best position to make the best use of them. So that's what we're trying to do. Come back to our natural state of grace. Now that we've talked a little bit about how powerful the mind is, I just want to say that there's a downside to the whole movement of mind-body medicine. And that is people oversimplifying. You know, people saying, oh gee, if I'm sick, it's entirely because I was thinking wrong. And if I just learn to think right, then I will be well. And truly, I wish it was as simple as that. But it is not as simple as that. I had the chance to be with the Dalai Lama back in 1989 at the first International Congress on Health and Healing, which was in India. And this was the first question that I asked His Holiness, because I've seen how much pain people go through when they blame themselves for getting sick. And I asked him, I said, what should I tell people? And he said, in a very gracious, very respectful way, tell them not to be so simple-minded. And then he gave such a beautiful lecture. He said, don't forget about genetics, don't forget about environment, and don't forget the power of your mind. But it's only one part of many things that impinge on health. And I would also say, in a certain way, you look at the power of the mind of one individual, and you have to realize many people's minds come together. For example, in deciding should we pollute the environment or unpollute the environment, which is a big effect on health. So, one of the most important things is to recognize you did not think yourself ill. However, your mind has a tremendous amount of power in helping you to become well again. That you can do. I want to just mention a couple more studies looking at mind-body medicine and looking at what guilt does to us and looking at the opposite of that, what connectedness does to help us. Guilt isolates you, don't you think? It makes you think, oh boy, I'm not good here. No, if some